Mother tried to ruin my wedding and turn my fiancé against me. Then I left the house. She begged for forgiveness, but it was too late. My wedding is a month away, and things have taken a weird turn that I never saw coming. I'm Jessica, 28, and I've always been close to my mom, Elaine. Or at least, I thought I was. Things between us took a pretty dramatic turn when my mom recently remarried. Daniel, her new husband, is a decent guy, I guess, but he's definitely no replacement for my dad, Peter. For a bit of context, my parents split up when I was 16. It was rough, but my dad and I stayed close. Mom, however, still holds a lot of resentment towards him, and I think her marriage to Daniel was partly her way of moving on and maybe even sticking it to my dad a little. I was happy for her, until she brought up a very unsettling idea for my wedding. A couple of weeks ago, we were sitting in the living room of the house I grew up in. It was a warm, sunny day, and the place was filled with memories of family Christmases, birthdays, and all the stuff that makes you feel at home. Suddenly, Mom says, "Jessica, I think Daniel should walk you down the aisle." I was so shocked, I almost dropped my coffee. I thought she was joking, but nope, she was dead serious. I immediately said, "No, Mom, Dad is walking me down the aisle. That's not even up for discussion." But she wouldn't let it go. "Your father abandoned us, Jessica," she said, with this look like I was betraying her by even considering my dad. "He was never there for you or for me. Daniel is your stepfather now. He's the one who should be giving you away." I could feel my face heating up. My dad didn't abandon us. He moved out, yeah, but he was always around when I needed him. He wasn't perfect, but he was there. I told her, "I want Dad to be a part of this. He's my father. You can't just erase him." Her expression turned cold. I've seen my mom mad before, but this was something else. It was like she was trying to manipulate me by guilt-tripping me. "After everything I've done for you," she started, with that edge in her voice, "you still choose him over me? Do you know how much that hurts, Jessica?" I was stunned. I mean, how was this even about her? I told her that this wasn't a competition. I was trying to include my dad, not exclude her. But she wouldn't back down. She kept pushing, saying that Daniel had stepped into our lives when Dad left, and that I should be grateful to have someone like him. At this point, I was practically shaking. I'd always respected my mom's opinions, but this was my wedding, my decision. I'd made up my mind. I stood up, looked her in the eye, and said, "Dad will walk me down the aisle. That's final." And then I walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there, fuming. For a while, I thought that would be the end of it. I figured she'd cool off and realize how unreasonable she was being. But the very next day, she brought it up again. She started saying things like, "Jessica, do you want to ruin my marriage? Daniel is hurt by your decision. This wedding should be a family affair, and you're splitting us apart." She kept saying that Daniel deserved to feel included, that he was part of the family now. I get it, sure, but he's been around for 2 years. I've known my dad for my entire life. I tried explaining this to her, but she just kept pushing back, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful. It became a daily fight. Every time we talked, she would find some way to bring it up and pressure me into reconsidering. I could tell she was trying to wear me down, hoping I'd eventually cave. And each time, I'd tell her no, and each time, she'd get a little more agitated. The worst part was when she started saying things like, "Do you even care about me, Jessica? After everything I've sacrificed for you, this is how you repay me." It felt like emotional blackmail, and it hurt. But at the same time, it was pushing me further and further away from her. I thought about just going along with it to keep the peace, but I knew it would eat me up inside. I'd already agreed to let Daniel be in some of the family photos, but I wasn't budging on the walk down the aisle. That was Dad's moment, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. All right, so after that awful showdown with my mom over who would walk me down the aisle, I figured things might settle down. I was wrong. In fact, things have only gotten worse. Mom is like a storm that just won't pass. Every time I think she might let it go, she finds a new way to dig her claws into my wedding plans. It's honestly like she's determined to ruin everything. First, it started with these little accidents. I noticed that some of the invitations went missing right after I'd finished printing them. At first, I thought maybe I just miscounted, but I found them in the trash can in the kitchen the next morning. I confronted Mom about it, and she acted all surprised. "Oh, honey, I must have thought they were scrap paper." "Yeah, right. They were still in the envelopes, with postage and everything." Next, she started messing with my appointments. I had a meeting scheduled with the florist, and when I got there, they told me the appointment had been canceled. I knew I hadn't canceled it, so I asked them who did. They said it was a woman who identified herself as my mother. I was so embarrassed and frustrated. I had to reschedule everything, which put me behind on my planning. When I got home, I confronted her again. I asked, "Mom, did you cancel my florist appointment?" She didn't even try to deny it. She just shrugged and said, "I thought you were spending too much on flowers, Jessica. You should be more practical. Weddings aren't about material things." I was fuming. I had saved up for this wedding for 2 years. I'm talking about cutting back on nights out, skipping vacations, and working extra shifts to make sure I could afford everything I wanted. And now she was acting like I was being irresponsible. I told her it wasn't her place to make those decisions for me, and she rolled her eyes like I was a petulant teenager. But then things took a darker turn. A week later, I found out she'd gone behind my back and tried to change the venue. I had chosen this beautiful garden space, filled with flowers, lots of open air, a perfect mix of natural beauty and elegance. I'd pictured myself walking down a path lined with roses, surrounded by everyone I loved, with my dad right beside me. Well, my mom apparently called the venue and tried to switch it to a community hall in town. I couldn't believe it when the venue manager called me, saying they were confirming the change request. When I told her I hadn't made any change, she mentioned that someone claiming to be my mother had made the request on my behalf. I immediately knew it was her. I called Mom, absolutely furious. I barely even let her say hello before I launched into it. "Why are you sabotaging my wedding, Mom?" I demanded. "This isn't your wedding. It's mine, and I'm sick of you trying to ruin it." She tried to play innocent at first, but when I mentioned the venue, she just laughed. "Jessica, that garden is way too expensive. A community hall is much more practical," she said, as if she was doing me a favor. I couldn't believe her nerve. I told her I'd rather cancel the whole wedding than let her change another detail. She didn't seem to care. She just kept going on about how I was being ungrateful and how Daniel was disappointed that I was excluding him from my life. At that point, I was ready to explode. I started yelling, which I almost never do. I told her that this wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but she was turning it into a nightmare. I said that I was tired of her trying to make everything about Daniel and her new marriage, and I couldn't believe she was willing to ruin my wedding just to make some point about him. She acted like I was overreacting, saying I was being dramatic, but I could see it in her face. She was loving every minute of this. I realized then that this wasn't just about Daniel walking me down the aisle. This was about control. She wanted to be the one calling the shots, and she was willing to go to extreme lengths to make that happen. After that conversation, I took matters into my own hands. I changed all my passwords, locked down every appointment with a confirmation pin, and made sure that only I could make changes to anything wedding-related. I even asked the venue and vendors to ignore any calls from her. They were sympathetic, especially after I explained what was going on. But the sabotage didn't stop there. About a week later, I discovered that she had been reaching out to my fiancé, Liam. I guess she figured if she couldn't get to me directly, she'd try going through him. She invited him over for coffee, and apparently, she spent the whole time talking about how concerned she was for me, making it sound like I was unstable and needed someone to talk some sense into me. Thankfully, Liam knows me well enough to see through her tactics. When he got home, he told me everything she'd said, and I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. I was glad he hadn't fallen for it, but I was also furious that she was trying to undermine me with my own fiancé. Liam and I had a long talk about boundaries, and he promised he'd support me no matter what, but I could tell he was rattled. That conversation with Liam was a turning point for me. I realized that my mom's manipulations were starting to affect more than just me. They were impacting my relationship with the man I was about to marry. I couldn't let that happen. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let her ruin this for us. I went over to her house and had what I hoped would be the final showdown. I told her, straight up, that she was no longer welcome at my wedding. If she couldn't respect my decisions and boundaries, then she had no place there. She laughed in my face, like she didn't believe I'd actually go through with it. "You'll come crawling back," she said, with this smug look that made my skin crawl. "You always do. I'm your mother, Jessica. You need me more than you think." I walked out of there feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. On one hand, I was heartbroken that it had come to this, but on the other hand, I felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was finally standing up for myself, and it felt good. Since then, she's been sending me guilt-trip texts, and I haven't responded. I know she'll probably keep trying to find ways to interfere, but for the first time, I feel like I have some control over my own life again. It's sad to think that it might come down to cutting her out completely, but if that's what it takes to protect my happiness, then so be it. After deciding to cut my mom out of the wedding, I thought things would settle down. I was wrong. The week following that confrontation was full of stress and uncertainty. Mom started spreading rumors to family and friends, painting me as ungrateful and rebellious. I started getting these passive-aggressive messages from aunts, cousins, even a couple of my mom's friends, all subtly urging me to forgive her and let her be part of the wedding. It was exhausting. One evening, I got home from a long day of tying up loose ends for the wedding and found my phone blowing up with messages from my mom. I had almost blocked her number but left it open in case of emergencies. Mistake. She was firing off messages like I was supposed to respond to her every whim. The gist? She was furious that I'd had the audacity to cut her out, and she went on this tirade about how I'd regret this for the rest of my life. Typical guilt-tripping stuff, but it still stung. I decided it was time to move in with Dad temporarily. Liam was okay with it, even if it meant a bit of chaos right before the wedding. So I packed up, called Dad, and he didn't hesitate to say yes. When I arrived at Dad's place, it felt like coming up for air after being underwater too long. He hugged me and said, "You don't need to worry about her here." Those words were like a balm. I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in months. Over the next few days, Dad and I talked a lot about everything, from the wedding to his memories of Mom when they were together. He told me things I didn't know, like how she'd always been possessive and sometimes even manipulative, even when they were dating. It was an eye-opener. I'd always seen my mom as tough but fair, but now I saw there had been a darker side to her all along. We spent time reminiscing about old times and looking through photos. It felt good to be around someone who really understood me without an agenda. I started to feel more grounded, more sure that keeping Mom out was the right decision. But just when I thought I'd finally found peace, she showed up at Dad's house. I'd stepped out to grab groceries, and when I returned, there she was, sitting in the living room with Dad, looking every bit the picture of righteous indignation. She looked at me with this smug expression, as if she'd won some twisted game. Dad looked uncomfortable, but he didn't want to escalate things. She started in right away. "Jessica, what do you think you're doing? Running to your father, of all people? He's just filling your head with lies," she snapped, as if I were a child being reprimanded. I was too stunned to respond for a moment. I hadn't anticipated her following me here, of all places. But then I realized that she'd come because she was desperate, and it felt like a power struggle she was determined to win. I finally found my voice. "Mom, you can't keep doing this. You're making this about you, and it's not. It's my wedding, and I want you to leave." I tried to keep my tone steady, even though I could feel my hands shaking. I wanted her to know I meant every word. She looked at Dad, probably hoping he'd back her up, but he just shook his head and told her, "Elaine, you should go." That seemed to set her off even more. She started in on him, too, bringing up old fights from their marriage, accusing him of turning me against her. After Mom's dramatic exit from Dad's place, I thought I'd finally seen the last of her antics. The relief was like a weight lifting off my shoulders, and with only a few days left until the wedding, I was determined to focus on the positives. I had Liam, my dad, and a core group of friends who were all thrilled for me. I was ready to close this painful chapter with my mom and move on. The wedding day arrived, and it was perfect. The garden venue was even more beautiful than I'd imagined, with soft sunlight filtering through the trees, casting a warm glow over everything. Dad was by my side, just as I'd always wanted, and he looked so proud as he walked me down the aisle. I could feel the love and support from everyone around us, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was truly happy. Liam was waiting at the altar, beaming, and as we exchanged our vows, all the tension and stress from the past months melted away. In that moment, it was just him and me, promising to love and support each other no matter what. It felt right, like the start of something beautiful and hopeful. We shared our first kiss as husband and wife, and the cheers from our family and friends brought me back to reality. It was over. I was finally married, and nothing my mom had done could take that away from me. The reception was just as magical. I danced with Dad, laughed with my friends, and felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. I hadn't realized how much my mom's constant influence had overshadowed my life until it was gone. It felt like I was free, and I could finally be myself without worrying about what she would say or do. Liam and I left the reception on a high, feeling like we'd just survived a storm and come out stronger on the other side. A couple of weeks later, as Liam and I settled into married life, I thought I'd finally left all the drama behind. But then, one afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before picking up, and as soon as I heard the voice on the other end, my heart sank. It was my mom. "Jessica, it's me," she said, her voice unusually soft. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to see you. I need to talk to you." She sounded different, almost fragile, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of worry despite everything that had happened. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a cafe downtown. I was nervous, not sure what to expect, but I knew I needed some kind of closure. When I arrived, she was already there, looking surprisingly worn and tired. It was like the fire that usually fueled her was gone. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the mom I remembered from before everything fell apart. We sat in silence for a few moments before she finally spoke. "Jessica, I'm sorry," she began, her voice shaky. "I know I've done a lot of things that have hurt you, and I'm not proud of how I handled things. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I see now that I was wrong." I listened, feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me was angry, but another part felt a strange sense of relief. This was the apology I'd wanted for so long, but hearing it now, I wasn't sure how to feel. She went on, explaining that she'd been going through a rough time with Daniel, that things weren't as perfect as she'd made them out to be. She admitted that she'd let her issues with Dad cloud her judgment, and that she had projected those feelings onto me. "I guess I was scared, Jess," she said, looking down at her hands. "I was scared of losing you, scared of being alone. Daniel, things aren't going well with him, and I think I tried to cling to you to fill that void. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you in the process. It was a lot to take in, and I sat there, trying to process everything. For so long, I'd wanted her to acknowledge what she'd done, to admit that she'd been in the wrong. And now that she was, I wasn't sure what to say. I could see that she was genuinely remorseful, but I couldn't ignore the damage that had been done. I took a deep breath and finally spoke. "Mom, I appreciate that you're apologizing, but I can't just forget everything that's happened. You put me through hell these past few months, and it's going to take time for me to heal from that. I need space, and I need you to respect that." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and I could see that my words had hit her hard. She reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it lightly. "I understand, Jessica. I'll give you the space you need. I just want you to know that I love you, and I'm here if you ever want to talk." I left the cafe feeling a strange sense of closure. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an ending. I knew that my relationship with my mom would never be the same, but at least I could move forward knowing that I'd finally stood up for myself and set boundaries. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life, and I was ready to focus on building a future with Liam. After that final meeting with my mom, I truly believed I was moving on. I'd started putting down roots in my new life with Liam, savoring the small routines we were building together. Our weekends were filled with lazy breakfasts, long walks, and day trips to nearby towns. I loved the simplicity and peace, the feeling that everything was finally falling into place. But as it often goes, just when you think you've left your troubles behind, they find a way of creeping back in. About a month after my conversation with Mom at the cafe, Liam and I received an unexpected visitor. It was a Saturday morning, and we were lounging around, planning our day, when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Liam gave me a puzzled look before heading to answer it. I followed him, curiosity pulling me along, but nothing could have prepared me for the person standing on the other side of the door. It was Daniel. He looked different from the last time I'd seen him. The usually confident and polished man now had a disheveled look about him. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair messy, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. My stomach dropped. What was he doing here? "Jessica," he said, his voice strained. "I know this is unexpected, but I really need to talk to you." I glanced at Liam, who gave me a reassuring nod before stepping aside to let Daniel in. We led him to the living room, and he took a seat on the couch, running a hand over his face as if trying to gather his thoughts. There was an awkward silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl, before he finally looked up at me. "Jessica, I know things between us have never been great," he began, "and I'm not here to cause trouble. I need to clear the air about a few things, for your sake and for mine." I folded my arms, trying to appear composed, but inside, my heart was racing. Daniel was the last person I'd expected to see, and I had no idea what he was about to say. But his expression was so raw, so different from the smug confidence he usually exuded, that I found myself willing to listen. He took a deep breath and started talking. "Your mother and I, things between us have been rough. I know you know that by now, but there are things you don't know, things I haven't told anyone because I didn't think it would ever matter. But now, after everything that's happened, I feel like you deserve to know the truth." The truth? My mind was already racing with possibilities. Was this about their separation? Was there more to it than I realized? "Jessica, your mother. She never got over your father," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She used to talk about him all the time, even when we were first dating. At first, I thought it was just part of the healing process, but as time went on, it became clear that she wasn't letting go. She held on to this deep resentment, and it started eating away at her. I tried to help, but no matter what I did, I could never measure up to him. I could feel the tension in the room, the weight of his words pressing down on us. I'd known that Mom had issues with Dad, but I hadn't realized just how much it had affected her new marriage. As he spoke, I felt a strange mixture of sympathy and frustration. I understood that Daniel was hurting, but he wasn't blameless in all this. He'd allowed himself to become part of her manipulation, and now, here he was, seeking absolution. He continued, "When your mom asked me to walk you down the aisle, I knew it was wrong. I knew it wasn't my place, but I also knew how much it meant to her. She thought it would be a way to rewrite history, to fix something she believed was broken. She convinced herself that if she could just control this one thing, it would make up for all the years she felt abandoned by your dad." I shook my head, trying to process everything he was saying. It all felt like a bad dream, like I was watching someone else's life unravel before me. But this was my life, my family, and these were the people who had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Liam reached over and took my hand, grounding me. His presence was a steady reminder that I wasn't alone in this, that I had someone who loved me and would stand by me no matter what. I squeezed his hand, drawing strength from him as I prepared myself for whatever Daniel was about to say next. "There's more, Jessica," Daniel said, looking away as if he couldn't bear to meet my eyes. "Your mom, she made me do things I'm not proud of. When you started making your wedding plans, she pushed me to interfere, to make sure things went her way. She wanted to control every detail, not because she cared about you, but because she wanted to feel powerful. And I went along with it because I thought it would make her happy. But all it did was drive us further apart." I felt a surge of anger, but it wasn't directed at Daniel. It was at my mother. I'd spent so much time blaming him, seeing him as the villain in all of this, but now I could see that he'd been manipulated just as much as I had. He wasn't innocent, but he wasn't the monster I'd painted him out to be either. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" I finally asked, my voice shaking. "Why are you telling me all this now?" He looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I just needed to get it off my chest. Or maybe I'm hoping you'll understand that I never wanted to hurt you. I know I can't undo the past, but I wanted you to know the truth, at least. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I could feel the anger, the sadness, the betrayal all bubbling up inside me, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. Daniel's confession, as painful as it was, had given me a new perspective. I could see now that he wasn't the root of my problems. He was just another victim of my mother's manipulations. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what to do with all this right now, but I appreciate your honesty." He nodded, and for a moment, we just sat there in silence. It was a heavy silence, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid, but it was also a silence of understanding. I didn't forgive him, not entirely, but I understood him a little better now, and that, in its own way, felt like a step forward. After Daniel left, Liam and I sat together, processing everything that had just happened. He held me close, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of calm. I'd been through so much, but I was still standing. I'd faced the truth, even when it was painful, and I'd come out stronger on the other side. But as the days passed, I started to notice something strange. My mom wasn't just avoiding me. She seemed to have disappeared entirely. No messages, no phone calls, nothing. I reached out to a few family members, but no one had heard from her. It was like she'd vanished without a trace. One evening, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a private investigator. Apparently, my mom had hired him to dig into my life, to find out if there was anything she could use to manipulate me further. I was floored. She'd gone so far down the rabbit hole that she was willing to spy on her own daughter just to maintain control. The investigator apologized, saying he hadn't realized the extent of her obsession until it was too late. He'd stopped working for her once he realized what she was asking him to do, but he felt it was important to let me know. I was horrified, but also strangely relieved. I now had confirmation that cutting her out of my life had been the right decision. It had been a month since the letter arrived from the law firm. I set up a meeting with the attorney, unsure of what to expect. Elaine had requested that I attend alone, but I decided to bring Liam. I didn't want to face whatever she had planned without support, and he agreed without hesitation. We entered the dimly lit office, where a receptionist escorted us into a spacious meeting room. My mother was already seated at the long, polished table, her posture stiff and her expression guarded. "Jessica, thank you for coming," she said, offering a tight nod. She glanced at Liam but didn't acknowledge him directly. The attorney, Mr. Thompson, appeared and gestured for us to sit. Without delay, he launched into the formalities. "Mrs. Elaine Walker has requested this meeting to discuss her estate planning," he began, handing me a hefty file of documents. "Before we proceed, there are some personal matters Mrs. Walker would like to address with you, Jessica." I opened the file and quickly scanned the pages. The estate was straightforward. Elaine was leaving most of her assets to me, with several charitable donations detailed for some personal belongings. She had placed restrictions on the family home, which couldn't be sold but could be rented. There was also a trust fund mentioned, and a stack of additional instructions that would apparently require my signature. "Jessica, I didn't expect you to be pleased by this," Elaine said, watching me closely as I skimmed the pages. "But I wanted to ensure you understood my intentions." I glanced up, meeting her gaze directly. "And what intentions would those be, exactly?" My tone was colder than I intended, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Elaine didn't flinch. "These terms reflect my final wishes," she replied. "I don't expect you to agree with them, but I need you to know why I made these decisions." She took out a slim envelope and slid it across the table. "Read this when you're ready. It might provide some clarity." I picked up the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, I set it aside and turned my attention back to the documents, flipping through until I'd seen enough. I nodded at Mr. Thompson, signaling that I understood the basics, and he began going through the details. He outlined the trust conditions and explained that it would fund any maintenance or repairs for the family home, but there were stipulations about how it could be used. Elaine sat quietly through the explanation, her gaze drifting occasionally to the window. When Mr. Thompson finished, she cleared her throat. "That's everything I needed to say. I know this isn't the resolution you wanted, but it's what I believe is best." Without waiting for a response, Elaine stood and walked out, leaving me and Liam alone with Mr. Thompson. He handed me another set of documents for signatures, which I quickly completed before Liam and I left. Outside, we walked silently to the car, the envelope still clutched in my hand. I didn't open it then, and we drove home in silence. 2 days later, I received a call from my Aunt Susan. Her voice was frantic, barely controlled as she relayed the news. "Jessica, it's your mother. She passed away last night. It was sudden, a heart attack." The words hit me like a punch, but there was no time to react. Arrangements had to be made, and Aunt Susan was leaning on me to handle them. I agreed, still holding the envelope from Elaine, now unopened, in my hand. I had almost forgotten about it, but with her sudden passing, it felt heavier than ever. I slipped it into my coat pocket as Liam and I hurried to the family home, where Aunt Susan and a few other family members had gathered. The funeral came together quickly. It was small and subdued, just as Elaine would have wanted. I handled the arrangements with Susan, selecting a simple casket and a few tasteful flower arrangements. The service was held at a quiet chapel with only a handful of guests, mostly family members and a few of her close friends. Liam stayed by my side the entire time, a steady presence in the midst of the somber atmosphere. After the service, we returned to the family home. Aunt Susan had invited everyone to gather there, and soon the house was filled with murmurs and the clinking of cups as people settled in to pay their respects. I drifted from room to room, accepting condolences and thanking people for coming. It felt surreal, seeing so many people I hadn't spoken to in years, all here to say goodbye. While I moved through the house, Liam found me and gently pulled me aside. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, and he slipped his arm around me, guiding me to a quieter corner of the room. We stood there, observing the small crowd, when Susan approached. "Jessica, there's something you should see," she said, gesturing for me to follow her upstairs. I glanced at Liam, who nodded, and together we followed Susan to Elaine's bedroom. She opened a small drawer in the nightstand and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. "Your mother wrote in this every day," Susan explained, handing it to me. "I think she'd want you to have it." I accepted the journal and placed it in my bag, deciding to read it later. As we headed back downstairs, I noticed Daniel had arrived. He stood in the hallway, looking uncertain, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He glanced up as we descended, his face a mix of emotions I couldn't quite place. "Jessica," he greeted me with a small nod. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I needed to say goodbye too. I nodded. "Thank you for coming, Daniel." The words felt strange, but I meant them. Despite everything, he'd been part of her life, and she'd cared for him in her own way. Daniel lingered for a moment before speaking again. "Elaine and I, we had our differences, but she was a remarkable woman. Stubborn as hell, but she had a way of getting under your skin." He gave a small, sad smile before excusing himself to join the other guests. The day wore on, and gradually, people began to leave. As the house emptied, Liam and I started to clean up, gathering cups and plates left behind. It was a quiet, almost meditative process, and as we worked, I found myself thinking about the letter. Once we finished tidying, I decided it was time to finally read it. I sat down on the sofa, the envelope in my hands. Liam settled beside me as I unfolded the paper inside. The letter was short, written in Elaine's tidy handwriting. "Jessica, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I know I wasn't the mother you wanted, and I can't change that. But I want you to know that I loved you in the only way I knew how. I hope you find peace, and I hope you forgive me someday. Take care of the house. It's yours now. Love, Mom." I folded the letter, placing it back into the envelope. Liam reached over and took my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. We sat there in silence, the letter resting between us, a quiet testament to everything that had happened. The next day, I returned to the family home with Liam to start sorting through Elaine's things. We decided to tackle the attic first, hoping to get the most daunting part out of the way. As we climbed the narrow stairs, dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight streaming through the small attic windows. It felt like stepping back in time, with old trunks and boxes stacked haphazardly around the room. We opened the first trunk, revealing a collection of photo albums and mementos from my childhood. I picked up a framed photo of me as a toddler, sitting on Elaine's lap, both of us grinning at the camera. Liam leaned over my shoulder, smiling as he looked at the picture. "She looks happy there," he remarked. I nodded, setting the photo aside as we continued to dig through the trunk. We found more photos, birthday cards, and even some of my old toys. The next box was filled with letters, some addressed to my dad, others to various friends and family members. There was one envelope marked Jessica, written in Elaine's familiar handwriting. I opened it, revealing a stack of letters Elaine had written to me over the years but never sent. They were filled with advice, anecdotes, and small notes about her hopes for me. I handed a few to Liam, and we read through them in silence, each letter revealing a different facet of the woman I had struggled to understand. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.